So today we're going to be talking about Perfetto, how you can use Perfetto to basically conduct kind of like an X-ray of everything that is happening in your world, so you can then take actions and decide what you can keep or what you should adjust in order to make your world more performant. So today is going to be a lot of like hands-on. Like for example, I want you to take from this session the thought process of how to read Perfetto traces instead of me prescribing exactly, like for example, this is where you have to go every time that you find something, right? Like for example, the idea today is kind of like to understand what the flow is and how the Perfetto traces change depending on what things are in place in the world. I already have a bunch of like Perfetto traces that I captured that we could, just start looking at them. But during the first minutes of this presentation, I'm gonna be doing all those steps manually so you can see the full process and the way you can, you basically observe how that works. So the presentation today, according to the skills matrix, correspond to scripting and arts. Normally, everything that pertains to performance affects both scripting and arts because depending on what the Perfetto traces is giving you, then you can make adjustments in the world, either on art or in scripting to make it more performant. As an important info for this presentation, this session is being recorded. Raise your hand when you have a question. Even though that is there, I would prefer, like for example, like if you seem like too like into the presentation, sometimes I might not look at the chat right away. So feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question, and yeah, basically just explain the background of your question, and then I'll do my best to answer it. Also be active in the chat. I'll do my best to pause every now and then to kind of like to read through the chat and see what questions are in there. And remember to fill the feedback survey at the end of the presentation. And of course, tag me in the corresponding channels for feedback. So optimization checklist. This checklist is actually available in the Learn portal. And this is basically a recommended approach whenever you are trying to find optimization opportunities in your world. You don't have to know everything about all the performance tools that we have. Uh, the basic tools that you have, like, like the base capture and the real-time metrics are good enough. You normally only use Perfetto if you, let's say, use all those resources and your world is still having issues. And then you want to dive deep into the what other things you can change to make your world more performant. But in the ideal scenario, this is the checklist that you have to go through. First, you identify if there is a problem. Are your players like crashing when they enter the world? Are the frame rates super low? Like for example, let's say like instead of like running over 60, they're running like 30, 40 frames per second. Are things not responsive? For example, let's say you send an event and then you notice that that object that is supposed to receive an event, that happens like a few seconds after. Those are a few examples of performance problems that you might encounter in your world. After you do that, then you do a base capture and use the real-time metrics that you have in your menu in headset. And they are also available on mobile if you visit the world in publish mode. And they are going to give you kind of like a high-level overview of what the current values on different categories your world is performing currently. For example, like it gives you like things like draw calls, memory usage, frames per second, of course, CPU and GPU usage, and all that. So that's your first approach. After you use those tools, if you notice any like spikes, you can then focus your capture in that area and then see if you can then, just by changing the collision of something, replacing the texture, if that solves the problem. However, if you do a lot of like, refactoring in your code and the art, and you still have problems, this is where the depends get Perfetto trace comes in. Like after you do everything that is like commonly known about performance, and then you still have problems, then you get a Perfetto trace. After you do those things, then you proceed then to remove things out of your world, and then you repeat the loop again to get either a new Perfetto trace or get the performance metrics again. And then you compare those two results, and then you decide if the trade-off is justified. One good example of that is like, for example, let's say like if the frame rates are super low and then you determine that the reason is because you have a mirror in your world, and then after you remove the mirror, you notice that the frame rate now is over 70. Now it's up to you to decide if that is a good trade-off. I would imagine, for example, like having a world where you have, let's say, like selling wearables, having a mirror is super important. So a way that players can see themselves, like how they look and stuff like that. So in that case, having that cost in the world is justified. But if you do keep that cost in the world, just make sure that you then remove that cost from other areas. Like if you have too many like meshes in the world, if you have too many textures, then go ahead and then adjust there instead of removing the mirror right away. And that is the fixed aspect of it. So the process of capturing a Perfetto trace, you can do this also, as I mentioned, on mobile. You can go in the world on mobile or also on web, and then you can capture the trace by pressing P on your keyboard, and then you're going to see similar options to this. But personally, I prefer to capture the trace on VR still, especially if the world is VR compatible, because that's going to give you kind of like the stress scenario of what the performance of the world is going to be. For mobile, there is a lot of like flexibility in terms of performance because the experience is streamed. Yeah, but but in VR, since we have a native app, all that information is downloaded, and every time that we download that information also affects performance. So this is my preferred way of capturing performance metrics. So if you are using VR, for example, you look at your wrist. If you have the utilities menu enabled, that you can enable by in your settings in your menu, then you can click on tracing. Once you click on tracing, then you're gonna see several options. Normally, the one that you want to use is the deep one. The overview gives you like a high level overview, like very like a super, like not without too much detail of it. But the deep one is the one that is gonna give you all the information that you're gonna need to make changes to the world. After you do that, those traces are automatically saved in your creator portal, where you are going to be able then to see the traces and download them and analyze them. We're going to do a lot of that today. And then after you open those traces in Perfetto, then you're going to see all the APIs and the duration of each one of them in the trace. And everything that we're going to be covering today is also documented in the Learn portal. There is one generic one for tracing that is under the performance tools category. And then the one that I use a lot is this one, analyzing trace data with Perfetto, that gives you detailed information of all the different APIs that you can see in Perfetto. So if I click on this one, it's going to take me there. And this the checklist that I shared with you during the presentation. But then if you scroll down, you're going to see like in-depth documentation about all the different things, all the different APIs that you can get information from Perfetto. This list is constantly changing. Every time that we get a new feature, like for example, now we have Avatar AI avatars, NPCs, AI NPCs, right? Those traces are going to be added to the results of your capture, right? So there's something to keep in mind that if you see something in the Perfetto trace that is not documented here, most likely that is going to be updated in the future, but the speed of how we are getting new features now, I think, is faster than the speed of the documentation updates. But just keep that in mind in case that you see something that is not documented. Also, since Horizon is based on Unity, many of these APIs are also available in the Unity documentation. So just by conducting a simple Google search, you should be able to find information about those APIs. Okay, so that was a lot of theory. I'm gonna pause there real quickly, look through the chat to see if there are any questions. And great, no questions so far. Perfect. Okay, so let's do some hands-on exercises here. So as the recommendation says, ideally you want to capture kind of like a base trace that gives you kind of like the information of what the normal world would be without having any like, let's say, noise, right? And that's what we're going to be doing first. So I already have an empty world This is the one that I'm going to be using to basically populate with different things. And then I have my other account here with that is going to be conducting all those traces. And then we're going to see how the trace changes progressively as we start adding things into the world. So let's go ahead and capture the base trace. Unfortunately, for this step, you won't be able to see it because if I were to, let's say, share from my headset, that involves a lot of the steps. And I want to make sure that at least we covered the meat or the more important part about the tracing, which is the analyzing the results, since the steps of capturing the trace is super straightforward. Okay, so what I'm doing, I'm going to describe what I'm doing on my headset. I'm looking at my wrist. Then I'm going to click on Start Tracing. Then normally it counts, I don't know, maybe like 5 or 10 seconds. And then I'm going to select a Stop Trace. So after that is done, I can then go to the Creator portal, which is this one. These are all the traces that I captured earlier. I refresh this. And after I do that, then here is my trace. So this is a normal result that you usually get with a trace. You get one file that represents the custom metrics. We will not be covering this today. This deserves its own workshop. But we do get the client results, and we also get the server data. And then we also have manual server data. So we have server and client data for both manual and generic results. Just a quick note about this one. We do have an API that allows us to annotate the Perfetto traces. So for example, let's say if you want to focus on a particular action in your world, you can use that API then to annotate the Perfetto trace, and then you can go there directly to analyze it. But as I mentioned, that's a whole world on its own. So most likely that should be its own workshop. Okay, so after we have this, we can then download those traces, or we can open it in Perfetto right away. However, since I'm going to be doing a lot of back and forth, I am going to download it as well. So I'm going to download the client version, and I'm also going to download the server version. And I'm going to keep them there in my downloads as a backup, and then I'll go back to those later. But let's open the server first. This is going to be Perfetto. I'm gonna keep it open here, and then I'm gonna put it here on the side. Again, you're gonna use this trace just as a baseline for the future things I'm gonna be doing in the world. So that one goes there. And then the other one is gonna be the clients. I'm gonna open it as well. This one goes over here. Which, by the way, I think it's best if I rename it, because if I keep it as is, then those numbers are going to be a little bit confusing. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to go back to my downloads here, and then I'm going to find the one that I just downloaded, and then I'm going to rename it. So this one I'm going to call demo 01. This one was the client base, and then the other one was demo 01 server side. That's going to make it now that if I drag and drop those traces in here, for example, this one is going to be the server. I'm going to drag it here. Then the name is going to show up here. It's going to be easier for me to see what's what. And then this one over here on the clients, I'm going to also do the same. So this one is going to be the client base. There you go. Okay. So after you have the trace, this is how the default looks like. So we start by looking at the data by clicking expanded this information here. And then you're going to see a lot of information that looks just like this. I know that this could look very overwhelming. But again, everything is going to start make sense after we start, progressively, as we start adding things into the world to see what happens. So this is currently what we have. The way how you can explore this data is by using your keyboard. If I press W, it's going to zoom in, and then we can see exactly what happens in each one of these APIs. If I press S, it's going to zoom out. And if I press A or D, then it's going to scrub left or right. This bar up here represents what portion of the trace I'm in. Like, for example, like if I all the way out, you can see now that this black bar basically represents, hey, I'm watching everything, I'm seeing everything. And then as I zoom in, that area becomes smaller. And then now I know how far I am from the end or from the beginning, right? Things that you can do with this data, as I mentioned, all these APIs are documented in that Learn portal. We're gonna be looking at some of those later on. But if you want to quickly summarize all of this, something that you can do is either press Control A to select all, or you can also select an area of the trace. Like if you notice something like strange, like something that looks out of place, you can select that area, and then the summary is going to be generated with that information only. So once once I select a section or I select all, this summary is going to be automatically generated for you. It's going to give you the list of all the APIs that are being used in the Perfetto trace, the duration in relation to the entire capture, also the average of each one of those, and how many times that API was detected in the trace. That applies for both client and server. Also, you get if for those of you that are familiar with SQL or SQL, you can also create pivot tables using scripting if you feel comfortable with that as well. But for now, let's see what differences we have between server and clients. So on the server, you're going to see all the traces that affect everybody in the world at the same time. You're going to see things like, on updates that are running on the server, things like simulating the physics, simulating the rendering, or when you see like another player moving around. I have player data here because I have two accounts right now in this world. So I capturing what happens with my avatar, with the one that I'm capturing the trace, as well as what is happening with the other one that is just floating in the air. Whereas in the client side, we're gonna have like a lot of more detail. It's basically, as you can see, this one is way busier than the server side. On the server side, we have all this space. When you see something like this one in particular called time update, wait for last presentation and update time. What this line in particular is doing is that basically filling the time for that frame, right, before executing the next frame. So in gaming in particular, it's important to have consistent frame duration to make sure that there aren't any glitches between the presentation of things or how things move in the world. So when there isn't too much going on, you're gonna see a small APIs at the start of the frame, and then you're going to have like, things like this. In this case, this is a good thing, basically telling you, hey, you have all this time still to fit things in the world. You can keep adding more things into the world, and then you can, this is your budget pretty much. Whereas in the client side, it's the opposite, right? In the client side, you have all this time that is available before the APIs run, basically telling you, hey, you have all this information available, but these are all the things that you're currently receiving. Again, if we zoom in and into all of this, think about all the different things that a player can do, that what the trace is basically saying, hey, the player is ready to execute all of this stuff. Right now, those are taking like super short, nanoseconds there, because nothing is happening in the world, right? So that's basically what that means. This is basically the zero state of the world. Nothing is currently happening, so we are not detecting any changes. The way how you read the Perfetto trace is top to bottom. So on the top, you see the frame itself. Then underneath it, you get kind of like a tree or different branches of how things are then represented depending on their category. So for example, under the frame, we have the player loop. The player loop normally just takes the entirety of the frame. And then under the player loop, we have then the category of player updates and also have information about time updates. As I mentioned, this is the basically filling up the frame right now to make sure that it stays consistent, either like over 60, 70 frames per second. And then, as I mentioned, if we keep zooming in, we see like different branches. This is the frame loop, then you have the player loop, and then inside the player loop, we have all the verts. These verts basically, this is kind of like confusing because, or might be confusing, verts doesn't mean geometry. Verts is everything that is networked. Basically things that the information that the player has to send to the server, and then the server has to send back to the player. That's what verts means. So whenever you see something like low frame rate, this is normally the place where you go to see what's going on. Okay, that's basically the base trace. I'm gonna pause there to see if there are any questions before I continue with more examples. No questions so far? All right. Okay, so let's continue with other things. For the next example, what I'm going to do is that I'm gonna add more players to the world. So let's see what happens. So for that, I'm gonna just use the NPC avatar. So I'm gonna do the gizmo and then the NPC, and then this one. And you'll see then how that affects the performance and the traces and all that. I'm gonna also increase the player count to a higher value. Let's go all the way to the top, 32, and duplicate this NPC gizmo to simulate that there are more players in the world. So 3, 4, 5, and that's 5. Then 10, 15, and 20. And let's do 25. Let's see if we can get it to 25. There you go. Okay, now we have all that. I'm gonna switch back again to my headset and capture the trace. And let's see how the trace changes between the base trace and the new one that we have right here. Let me wait until all the NPCs are in the world. There you go. And now let me switch back to my headset. I can see all of them. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and capture a trace. Okay, I'm capturing. And I am going to stop it. Something to know about traces is that you don't want to start a trace, play the entire experience. Like let's say like if you have like a PPV players versus player game, like a shooting game, you don't want to start the trace, when the game starts and then stop the trace when the game ends. That's gonna give you a lot of problems. The trace that grades, actually that's one of the issues. Like the trace itself, it starts like, like having bad performance readings, the longer it stays running, because that's information that is it keeps accumulating in those files, and that might give you bad or false results. So you want to make sure that every time that you capture a trace is short and focused to the point that you want to address. Okay, so now I captured that with the NPCs. I'm gonna go back to my performance category here on my creator portal. I'm gonna refresh this, and then there you go. We have 4 more files. So in here, I am going to do the same thing. I am going to download the manual client. So I'm gonna download it, and also the server side, this one here. By the way, if you see something that says like server_1, server_2, server_3, that's how you know that the trace has run like for too long, because basically it has a lot of data. And when that happens, then that file starts, like adding more and more and more files with a number here that represents, the file sequence. So after I download those two, I'm just gonna open 2 new Perfetto tabs in here. So this one is gonna be the server one. I'm just gonna open it here. I have a new tab. I'm gonna put it here at the end. And then the other one was the clients, this one here. Currently, I'm just doing this just because I want to open the tab, but actually what I'm going to do is that I'm going to rename it here and open it from the download files, just because I want to know what's what. So this one was the clients, and I need to download the server as well. So clients and server, this one. Download. Okay. And refresh. There you go. So this one would be demo 02 server. I'm gonna call this one NPCs. And this one is demo 02 client NPCs. So I know more or less what that means. And then I'm gonna open it in Perfetto so I can see the title of it. So first it's gonna be the server. And then the other one is going to be the client. There you go. So I'm going to put it side by side. Okay, so now that we have those two, again, that's the importance of having like a base trace. So where you can go back to it and kind of like to start to observe how things change when you start adding things to the world. So in this case, this is the server one, now with the NPCs in the world. The first thing that we notice here is that Perfetto had a hard time to start when I started the trace. When you see something like this, there is normally because there is kind of like a significant delay from the moment I press the button to start the capture until the moment Perfetto actually start capturing the trace, right? So that's basically the first thing that I noticed, that there is kind of like a void here, and that's basically Perfetto, kind of like because of the significant cost of adding all those players into the world. That's why Perfetto was having kind of like a hard time there. All these avatars, then there is a delay there. So now if I even zoom in a little bit more, we start seeing like some changes here. Like if I zoom in on this one here, you can start to see that the duration of these APIs now it takes longer, right? It's kind of like those takes a lot of space. Before, on the server side, we had all this time available. This one here, see how small that time now it is? This is basically the time that we have available to keep adding things into the frame. Whereas in the baseline, basically we have all this time available. Now we have like a really, really short time. And what is consuming all that information? The avatars that we have in the world right now. So that's basically the first thing. Like for example, when we're trying to decide how many players to add into an experience, know that if the world is full, just for the sake of those players being in the world, that is already consuming a lot of resources on the server side. We went from having all this time available to run, scripting and all that, and now that we have 32 players in the world, I think I have 27. I think we have now all this time used. And this is actually interesting because now if we zoom in, we can see now like how all these APIs now are changing, and each one of these represents each one of those NPCs. Like for example, this is what I mentioned, that every time that you add a new feature to the world, you're going to start seeing traces that you didn't have in the base trace. So in here, for example, we can see how much time each one of those NPCs is taking from in a single frame. And then you can then start deciding from there, hey, this probably having too many NPCs in the world is kind of like too costly for me. Maybe this is a feature that I have to like start to remove from the world. And then that's on the server side. That's how you can start seeing things changes in terms of like avatar. Let me see if there's anything else I want to mention here. Yeah, so for example, like when you go in depth with reading these APIs, we have this one here, NPC skeleton, because we're using NPCs. However, if you were using just real players, then you wouldn't get this trace. So you will actually get more time out of this. You're gonna release that time, but then you will see, however, it's related to real players, which is this one. The NPCs actually use both the APIs that pertains to real players and the APIs that pertains to NPCs as well. And similar changes, let's see, we should see similar changes on the client side as well. Like if I zoom out a little bit, I don't know if you can see, but for example, like in the new trace for the client, the color seems a little bit darker. That means that, for example, there are some more concentration around what happens on the client side. And even this is actually interesting. You can see how sometimes there are kind of like empty areas like this. And that's precisely when you experience, let's say, like a headlock, or when you experience, let's say, that your visitors freeze in the world. This is basically how it looks like when you see something like it's completely empty. What that is doing is that basically saying, hey, let me breathe for a minute, for a second or a frame or two, and then I'm gonna continue then, running as normal. In this case, for example, we are observing that when those hitches are happening, we have that the frame lasted 27 milliseconds. note that the normal frame should last only 13 milliseconds. That accounts for over 70 frames per second. However, with 27, that's when then your frame rate start degrading, and that's when you start experiencing those hitches and player freeze or they crash in the world. So that's how you can observe that in the trace. Okay, so that was with the scenario of adding a avatar in the world. So let's see what happens when we deal with the scripting. I'm going to jump ahead since we are already halfway there in the hour. I'm going to use some of the captures that I already have as an example, and then I'm going to talk through those. I'm going to close these two. Actually, no, let me keep it open. Reopen, close tab. And then I'm going to open in these two the examples that I have. So let's see, I have many examples in here. So one that might be interesting to you is how the events system affect a trace. So I have one example for call blocks, local events, and macro events. So let's see how call blocks look like. So call blocks will be this one here, trace number 10. So the server side, I'm gonna put it here. And then the client side over there, it's gonna be here. It's gonna be the client side for the call block event. Okay, so on the server side, when we are sending and receiving events, we get these additional metrics down here that basically tell us how many events we are sending. For this example, it was just a simple send event to object, and that's it, and then console log when that event is received. Something interesting that you can only know by looking at the Perfetto trace is, let me see if I can find it, an example here, is that the let me see if I can find it here. Something interesting here is that in Coblox, the event that you send in one frame is received on the next frame. It's not received immediately. So for example, if I were to find it here, see, actually I can do just this. I can just find it here. There you go. This is the event that is being processed. Then if I scroll up, this is where it is. So even though I am sending that event pretty much I'm sending on every second, right? So this is the one that actually processes the events. This is the one that handles the event, the one that I'm sending the test. But then the event itself is being sent on the prior frame. So this is the one that actually sends the event. So that's something to take in consideration, especially if you're dealing with Coblox events, because when you send an event and you don't see it happening right away, it's because it's being processed in the next frame. That is important, especially if you're deciding the order of how those events are being sent or received, because you want to make sure that the event, for example, let's say if you're moving something, or if you're detecting that the player enters the world, right? You first want to detect that the player enters the world, and sometimes you want to delay the execution of the logic that happens when the player enters the world in order to make it fail proof, right? Because if you run the logic right away, you might find hitches sometimes where either the logic doesn't execute or execute, not when you expected it to see. So that's what happened with Coblox events. I'm going to switch now to local events. And the story there is a little bit different. So local events on the server side, this is the one. Looks a little bit more clean. And then local events on the client side. Okay, so the first thing to know, or the first thing that you can notice here, is that this trace looks a little bit cleaner than the one that we observed with Coblox. And in fact, if we scroll down to the event systems, what the trace does is that instead of like detecting the event being sent on every frame, it just knows that there is an event that is being, sent or received do it in the trace, but because the local events are treated like methods, like for example, something that you just call directly from a function, those are executed in the same frame that you call them. So when you say that, send local event to an entity, that event is being sent and received in the same frame. So that's why that's one of the recommendations why it's often advised to use local events instead of call blocks events when you are trying to pass information from one entity to another, unless you are detecting, out of the box events, like when the player enters the world, when the player enters trigger, those are you cannot avoid those. You have to use call blocks events. But if you're communicating between entities, then it's recommended to use local events. What happens with local events, if I zoom in, is that you're going to see subscriptions. Like for example, you're going to see, it's going to be under scripting. There you go, scripting runtime. I have currently only one subscription, and that's why this looks super small. But if you had, let's say, like multiple subscriptions to events, then this area is gonna look more populated. So that's the only difference, right? Like for example, like in local events, the events are being sent and received on the same frame, whereas in call blocks events are received on the next frame, and then you have to account for that delay sometimes. And then last, on the network side, let's see how that looks. We have network events is going to be this one here on the server side. And then on the client side, it's going to be this one right here. Oh, I think I opened in the same one. So this is server one. Let me open it again. And then the client one is this one. So this one is going to be the client. There you go. Okay. So for network events, something more interesting happened here. I think if I search, I should be able to find it as send network events. If I press enter, there you go. So that's another thing that I didn't mention. You can definitely use the search functionality here. If you know the name of the API, when you do that, then if that API is found in your trace, then you're going to see here in yellow what category has it. And then you're going to see like a small yellow area up there that basically signifies where that API is being detected. So in this one, if I zoom out like really far, remember, I'm sending this event every second. You can see now that the send network events is being triggered after every second. So most likely after every 60, 70 frames. So if I zoom in, this is what happens. This is something very interesting with network events, is that we send the event in this frame. However, we receive it 2 frames later. With Coblox events, we send the event and then we receive it on the next frame. With local events, we send it and receive it on the same frame. However, with network events, we send it and then a frame passes without, without activity. And then on the following frame, which is this one, that's when the event is being received. You can easily tell from the distance here how the activity changes here. This one is skipped and then the next one follows. And the reason for that is that remember that network events, as the name implies, they have to be sent to the server, and then the server has to process that data, and then the server sends it back to the clients. So in that process, that's why the communication is slower. That's another thing to take into consideration, especially if you're dealing with local scripting, where you are sending information from a server script to a local one. The only way of communicating between those two is either using Coblox events or using either network events. There's always going to be a frame or two delay between the communication between those two. So if you notice, let's say, like if you're trying to transfer the ownership of something to a player and then you send an event immediately, a network event immediately to that local object, you might not see anything happening in the world because, again, because of the network condition between the transferring ownership between server to a client. Also, something here that is very important to know is that, let me see if I can find an example, is going to be, if I have it here, let me maybe go here. I thought I had it. I don't think that this trace has it, but maybe under RPCs. Let me see. So this one is the receiving end, and then we have the birds. Okay, this one doesn't have it. I want to show you how the console logs also affect the trace, but this one doesn't have it. If you are using, actually, no, it's going to be on the client. Let's go to the client side here. Let's open this one. Also, this one looks super busy. And then if I zoom in, if I look for outliers, this one here, when dealing with Perfetto, normally is a matter of like training your eye to detect variations. Like for example, like looking like from this eagle eye view, I can see that there are like thin blue lines in certain areas, indicating that there is a anomalies on those frames. And then if I zoom in, surprise, surprise, what this is the debug message that I'm printing when I'm receiving the events. So this is basically the back end of the recommendation of if you have a lot of, let's say, debug messages in your game, if you keep all of those after you publish, that's not a reason why you might experience hitches in your world, because those messages also affect the frame rate, because those have to be networked, to the client basically, so they can read it. So there you go. So you can see how that trace, if I compare this trace for the clients, this is the client one. And then if I go back to the base client one, to a frame, we don't see that duration on the network side of things. This is the bar that is growing tremendously when I'm receiving a console log here. So the width increases there just by having console logs, taking time out of the other APIs that I have in this for this client. Okay, I think that's a lot of information. I know this is dense information. The only way how you can get used to like reading this data and getting actionable things, items from these traces, is by getting used to capturing a base trace. Then you make changes to the world, whatever that might be, either adding new things or removing things that you currently have, then compare the two traces and then observe what APIs have changed. Like if I go back again to the NPC one, let's see, it was this one here. And then if you use those techniques that I showed you, like for example, let's say if I select all in here, then we'll get access to the summary here. It's telling me here that the average frame is like 16. I don't know if this one is going to be enough to affect that much the frame, but we'll see. Slices, and then we get that now is 1657 and frame 62. Something to take in consideration as well is kind of like the number of captures that you have. In this case, is the one that I just captured is only 228, the number of captures, whereas in the base one that I have is 519. So that's another thing to take into consideration to when you are comparing traces, that you want to make sure that they have the same length. The server side itself didn't change too much in terms of like duration of a frame. This is the frame without the NPC, 16 milliseconds, and then on the one with NPCs is similar results. However, if we compare the base client with the new clients, which is this one, and then we do the same thing here, select all, and then we go to slices. We see here that this one was originally 13.9, and then after adding the NPCs, increased to 1402, which might not seem like too much. But remember, the things that you're looking for are the hitches or outliers. When a player crashes into the world, it's not because of the average of what the world is reading, it's because of things like this one. Even though the average of all my reading here or all of my APIs is average, the average is only 14 milliseconds for the frame. Remember that if I zoom in, then these frames over here are up to 26 milliseconds. That's precisely the moments when the player crashes and then when you start having problems. So even though you have the average that looks okay, always make sure to dive into the zoom in and see if you see any big changes that might be affecting the experience in the world. Again, with Perfetto, I remember that the first time that I started playing with Perfetto, I spent like an entire day just capturing traces from a base trace to a new one to understand what is happening. And most commonly, what happens is that you capture a trace in a world that has problems, and then you start deleting things until you start noticing improvement in performance. Since that topic is like super long, I really, really recommend you to read at least once through this documentation to kind of like to get yourself familiar with all the different APIs that you can find in a Perfetto trace, and then what you can do whenever one of those attributes or API are super, beyond the recommended values. But yeah, you can get things like reading about rendering, about physics, about audio, particles, animations, scripting, following the same steps that we follow today. You capture your base, then you capture another one with a change, you compare the two, and then you see where you observe performance and where you observe, worse performance in the world. Okay, I think that that's a good stopping point. I know that many of you are probably focused on the competition world. I completely understand that. But yeah, let me know if you have any questions or if you have any comments, any concerns. If not, I'm gonna go ahead and drop the link to the survey in the chat. I know that I'm conscious that this topic is like super dense, so it might take a little bit of time to get used to using Perfetto traces, but this is one of the tools that has helped me the most when I am trying to find ways of optimizing a world. There are things that you can capture in here that you cannot see in other manner. So yeah, definitely recommend you to check those. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's again. Yeah, exactly, Ashley. Definitely, it's a very dense topic. And this is why one of the reasons why even Meta, in the documentation, they categorize the capture of Perfetto trace as it depends, right? Like for example, like if you really notice that there's nothing that you can do just with the real-time performance metrics or with a base capture, if you cannot solve your problem just with those, then a Perfetto trace is going to be the only way how you can then dive deep into what's happening in the world. Do I have open hours for training? Yes. So we beyond, besides the workshops, the MHCP program also offers open hours, normally basically open just Q&A sessions where creators can ask any random questions, including performance questions, and then we can answer through those. And then also if you are a partner, you also have access to one-on-one sessions where you can have a dedicated mentor, evaluating your world and then basically strategizing with what would be the best approach for improving the performance. But also you have access to the forum where you can ask questions if you have any particular question about the performance of any of your worlds. But yeah, we have different resources for sure. Um, let's see. Thank you, Pijan. This is super helpful. Let me move this over here. I not only understand more about traces and honestly learned a lot more about network and local. Very, very helpful. Thank you, Craig. Yeah, glad to hear that this was helpful. Any final comments or questions before we close? Let's see. I am definitely curious to try out. Thank you for the workshop. Yeah, for sure. And again, if you ever have any questions, just let me know and I'll do my best to answer those questions as well.